Ever wonder why open source software doesn't innovate faster than private companies? Even without a monetary incentive, one might think that there ought to be enough curious and motivated people on the internet who have ideas as to how various software packages could be improved upon. For example, when I browse the web, I would prefer that there wasn't so much shared information between tabs. From a privacy perspective, I wish all tabs by default would act like an incognito session. Armed with such an idea, how hard do you suppose it would be to say compile Chrome? Make these changes and find out. Well, today we'll just talk about that first step, compiling Chrome, and why it's not as easy as it ought to be. Compiling Chrome requires a lot of frameworks to be installed prior to even starting the build process. You need a particular version of Python, Node.js, and a recent version of Visual Studio, along with a particular version of the Windows Software Development Kit if you want to compile on Windows. Once those prerequisites were in place, the first challenge I found was just how big the source code of Chrome and all its dependencies have become. GitHub.com, the main source code repository, errored out halfway through the download process because I had used too much bandwidth. This required me to wait a day to finish simply downloading the source code, as I am in the fortunate situation where my IP address changes every day. If I had a more consistent IP address, I have no idea how long I would have to wait for GitHub to unblacklist me and allow me to continue downloading the source code files. At this point, the source files were taking up 70 gigabytes of disk space, and we were just getting started. To be clear, while there are a few complexities, web browsers in principle are quite simple and just need to be able to parse text files and display text and images to a screen. I have worked on many video games which were capable of rendering complex three-dimensional graphics 120 times a second and required millions of lines of code that took up less than a single gigabyte of disk space for the source code. It is kind of impressive just how much bloat has made its way into the Chromium browser, and I can only hope that a majority of that bloat was due to Git, the source code versioning manager of choice, downloading all the history of the repository, and not just the latest source of the main branch. On my second day of downloading from GitHub, we managed to finish that step and start the build. The build process for Chrome is a strange mishmash of Python, JavaScript, Go, and C++. Despite my computer having 64 gigabytes of memory, the build quickly filled that up, and Windows had a lovely blue screen of death. I can't blame the system crash entirely on the Chrome build, as the only reason such a crash was possible was Windows being a garbage operating system, but it is still impressive that the build system could be that inefficient. After recovering from that reboot, the build was in a corrupted state because some file had only been partially written to, but the error wouldn't tell me which one, and there was no command to clean up all intermediary files. After wasting another half hour searching online for a good way to clear the intermediary files, without also deleting all the source code of the various dependencies, I gave up and decided to try a different build target release instead of debug, which sidestepped that issue and started the build anew in a different folder with different settings. After about 30 minutes of compile time, I finally had a version of Chrome which I had compiled from the source code. Checking the folder size revealed that it had required 150 gigabytes to get to this point. That's 3 to 5 times more disk space than is required for a fresh install of Windows 11, a bloated mess of an operating system which I refuse to use, and just for compiling a web browser. No wonder there isn't more innovation if bloated projects like this are what people have to start from in the open source world. While Chrome may be a particularly bad example, it sadly matches my experience compiling a lot of other popular open source projects. 150 gigabytes is a pretty large commitment for most people, not to mention the risk of being blacklisted from GitHub for simply trying to download the source files, and the amount of time it takes to compile, which could easily take longer on a slower system. Getting over these initial hurdles are the easy part of this process. If you get this far and still remember your initial idea of an improvement you wish to make to the software, you now have the monumental task of figuring out where in this giant mess of code you need to make said changes. In the case I mentioned earlier of wanting to change the default tab behavior, the behavior I am looking for already exists within the browser for incognito tabs. So very little new logic actually needs to be added to the code. In theory, I just need to find where normal tabs are created in the code and where incognito tabs are created in the code, figure out the differences, and modify the normal tab behavior to be isolated in the same way an incognito tab is, straightforward in theory. Yet wading into such a large code base to find that logic is no easy task. In all likelihood, it might take the same amount of time to write my own browser from scratch than to find the right needles in this haystack. Neither path is easy. Both options would require a significant amount of time and effort. And if your innovative idea is less straightforward than this example, or if there's a risk, it might not be as great as you thought once you implement it, the motivation to even try is greatly diminished. In the future, I may go over what is required for those who continue past this point, but in answer of the initial question of why isn't there more innovation in the open source space, it's because the benefits of open source have largely been swallowed up by bloat and the lazy additions of countless dependencies, leading to the current monstrosity demonstrated in the Chrome codebase.